This morning I want to begin by, as I often do, telling you a story. It's a true story. It's a story of a young man named Hugh Burton. As I share this story, though, I want you to try and imagine what you would do in Hugh's situation. How it would feel to be in his shoes. It's 1989 and Hugh is a 16-year-old student at Evander Childs High School in New York. He lives in the Bronx, but his family are immigrants from Jamaica. His mother, Keisha, she was a nurse at a local nursing home. His father, Raphael's a general contractor, though at the time this story takes place, he's back home in Jamaica visiting family. They are, by all accounts, a very decent and hard-working family. That is the words of Sergeant Frank Vigiano. He's the commander of the local precinct's detective squad. Like his family, Hugh is a decent, hard-working sort of kid. He doesn't have a history of trouble at school. He performs well, and out in the community, he is not known as one of the troublemakers. He doesn't run with gangs, hasn't been involved in any of those sort of things in his life. One day Hugh comes home from school a little bit early, and he discovers something horrific. His mother, his anchor, his protector, has been tragically murdered. Can you even begin to imagine the pain and confusion that he feels in that moment? It would be unimaginable, right? It would be unbearable. He calls 911, he calls the police, hoping for answers and for justice. But instead of finding comfort or answers, instead, he found himself accused of that murder. He was barely out of high school. He was still learning who he was and where he would fit in the world. But within a matter of days of his mother's death, detectives pulled him into a cold, sterile interrogation room and insist that he was the one that did it. He was grieving, he was scared, he was completely unprepared for what came next. They kept him separated and isolated from his father, the only other person he felt he could trust in that moment. They questioned him relentlessly. They deprived him of sleep. They filled his head with all kinds of threats and promises. Hugh didn't have a lawyer present for most of those interrogations, but he did do his best to try and defend himself, to insist on his innocence. But their questioning, it was unrelenting. They were sure that Hugh had killed his mother, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. As their questioning continued, they began to build a theory that they just wouldn't let go of. Hugh, they decided, was addicted to crack cocaine. He had killed his mother in a fit of rage when she refused to give him money to pay off his dealer. Nothing, of course, indicated that Hugh was guilty of this. The crime scene didn't really fit with their theory at all. The New York Times, they reported that Keisha had her hands tied behind her back with a phone cord, that she'd been stripped of clothes from the waist down. That didn't make sense if this was a crime of passion, an explosive, drug-fueled outburst over money. It indicated, well, a completely different sort of crime. Nonetheless, they were convinced that they had their man. And ultimately so was the jury. Despite a lack of physical evidence tying him to the crime, despite maintaining his innocence throughout trial and sentencing, Hugh was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sent to an adult prison, though he was still just a teenager. His term, 15 years to life. A teenager, grieving his mother, innocent of any crime, so he insisted, was sent to one of the harshest environments imaginable. For 20 years and 8 months, Hugh was deprived of his liberty. Can you even imagine what went through his mind during those years as he lay on that cold, hard bed at night? How many times did he replay that interrogation? How often did those words said about him at trial, fabrications and lies he insisted, come back to haunt him? Of course, if you ask, every person in prison is innocent. No one will admit that they did what they were arrested for. But when Hugh said it, he really meant it. I wonder how often he questioned if anyone really believed him. 20 years and 8 months after first spending a night incarcerated, Hugh was released on parole, though that didn't really change things for him. He still carried the stigma of being a convicted murderer. He couldn't find a job. He couldn't live a normal life. Though he was out in the world, he was not truly free at all. Every day he maintained his innocence. He maintained that he'd been wrongly convicted, though few ever believed him. Hugh's story, it's heartbreaking. It is truly unimaginable, and yet that is what I've asked you to do, to try and imagine it. Because I want you to hold on to that feeling. The feeling of being falsely accused, of knowing that you're innocent, and yet being punished anyway. Imagine what you would do. Imagine how you would react, because this morning we've reached John chapter 19, and that is precisely what Jesus is going through. Falsely accused. Standing before Pilate, knowing that the charges were false, hearing the crowd chant, "Crucify him," despite his innocence. The one truly innocent man in all of history endures unimaginable accusations. And yet Jesus didn't just endure the injustice. He embraced it willingly for our sake. So today, as we look at John chapter 19 verses 1 through 16, let's consider how it feels to be wrongly accused. Let's reflect on the weight of carrying a punishment you don't deserve. More importantly, let's stand in awe of the one who chose that path, not because he had to, but because he loves us. Let's dive in. John chapter 19, beginning of verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I found no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I found no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered into his headquarters again and said to the Jews, "Where are you from?" But Jesus said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when he heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, in the Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now this was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to a place called the Place of the Skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Tis a harrowing passage, certainly. One that may perhaps even seem out of place as we approach the Christmas season. And yet we must never forget that this is the very purpose for which Jesus came to earth in the first place. So we will continue to focus on these passages even throughout the Christmas season. And I want to start by focusing on those first few verses here. Verses 1 to 6, they really explain to us just how humiliating it would have been for Jesus. They describe the humiliation of a truly innocent man. Last week we looked at the first part of Jesus' interrogation at the hands of Pilate. And even though Pilate comes to this conclusion for selfish reasons, as we thought about last week, at the end of that first exchange, Pilate does make a very bold and very true proclamation. He speaks the words, "I find no guilt in him." And Pilate is correct here. Jesus is blameless. But if anything, that makes what happens next even more horrific. Because though Pilate himself has found Jesus blameless, without fault, he still sends Jesus to be flogged. John uses some particularly harsh language here. We may not notice it, but he doesn't just say, "And Pilate sent Jesus to be flogged." He says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him." Of course, Pilate didn't hold the whip. We know that. He wouldn't have got his hands dirty in this way. But John uses this language here to indicate Pilate's guilt. In spite of his desire to wash his hands of the whole matter, his guilt here is undeniable. Pilate has found Jesus innocent. And yet in spite of that, he chooses to allow Jesus to be beaten, flogged, mocked, and adorned with a crown of thorns. After being whipped, Jesus is also struck and beaten by the crowd. Perhaps even some of those very same people who had welcomed him into the city as a king just a few days prior. He's dressed in a royal purple robe and wears a crown of thorns. It's a mockery of the fact that he is truly a king, and not only that, is divine. And then Pilate presents him to the crowd. John, and indeed all of the Gospels, deliberately avoid going into details about the nature of this beating, because the truth is, they don't need to. Their first audience, they would have been intimately familiar with just how brutal this would have been. They would have seen it with their own eyes. They would have known how the empire dealt with their enemies. He would have been scourged with a whip that has 3 or more leather straps. Each of those straps, those thongs, would have had a piece of bone or ceramic or rock or metal attached to it. He would be beaten 40 times or more. It was brutal. In fact, it was so brutal that the prophet Isaiah, writing centuries before, prophesies precisely how horrific it will be. Isaiah suggests that he would have been beaten so badly he would barely be recognizable as a human anymore. Isaiah writes these words: "His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind." That's Isaiah 52, verse 14. This is the man who Pilate presents to them, Christ battered and humiliated. When he says those words, "Behold the man," it's as if he's trying to show them, is this really someone who you would ever believe is divine? Look at what we've done to him. How can you take his blasphemy seriously? He's just a man, just like you. Look at him, if you can. Surely no one could believe he's a king, let alone a god. His words, they highlight the humiliation and the mockery of it all. This moment is not just about the cruelty of the soldiers. Really, it's about the deeper tragedy of how humanity responds to the truth, with mockery, with rejection. Instead of recognizing Jesus as their king, they ridiculed him. They turned his holiness into a spectacle. And as we hear this, it's easy to be appalled by it all. Yet the truth is, so many times, in our own ways, do the exact same things, don't we? Even as Christians, there are, I know for myself, times where I fail to see and honour Christ in my daily life, where it is, as it were, that I mock him and his sacrifice through my own actions, returning to sin rather than embracing the forgiveness he's given me, choosing my own way rather than his, taking his sacrifice and throwing it back in his face, even as one of his followers. And certainly the world who remain in sin do it so much more. And yet Jesus goes to the cross not only to atone for our past sins, those we did before we were saved. He does it even for the failings of his followers. He goes to the cross knowing that even after I embrace him, I'll continue to fall short. And he dies for those sins as well. Throughout this process, at a very fundamental level, truth has been on trial here. Jesus, of course, is truth. But more than that, it is a trial that gets to the very heart of what is truth, that question that Pilate asked that we thought about last week. Which is then what the next section seems to focus on here, verses 7 through 12. Jesus is precisely who he claimed to be. And there's more than enough evidence for anyone to conclude that. But the religious leaders of the day, they use fear and mob mentality to pressure Pilate. They cause him to shift his focus from seeking the truth and put it onto self-preservation. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid, John tells us. The crowd, they've already determined what the outcome should be. In some ways, this whole interaction with Pilate, it's a sham trial. It's just there for the appearance of it all. They already know. They want Jesus crucified, and they won't take no for an answer. Pilate doesn't want any part of this. And again, we've thought about how this is not necessarily for selfless reasons, because he believes Jesus, but because he doesn't want the mess, the fallout that he knows will come of it. He cares about his position, and he doesn't want to be seen by the empire to be a troublemaker anymore. There's this fear that perhaps he would lose control of the mob, that it would force the empire to come in to put down this uprising. And in the process, inevitably, he'd be removed from his position, perhaps even subjected to the very same torture that he was now prepared to put Jesus through. And this fear motivates Pilate far more than his desire to stand for the truth. Pilate tips his hand here. Do you not know, he asked Jesus, that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you? Power and authority, it's all that Pilate really cares about. Pilate knows his position, and he wants to flex his political muscles here. But Jesus responds simply this: you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Pilate says, I'm in charge here. And Jesus basically answers, you think you're the one in control here, but you're not. Not ultimately. This was always the plan. The verses that follow are interesting. They caught me off guard a little bit. We read the words, from then on Pilate sought to release him. And when we first read this, we think maybe Pilate is beginning to see the truth of it all. He wants to release Jesus because he's realizing what's really going on here. Certainly there are even Christian traditions that suggest that after this, Pilate became a convert. He became a believer in Jesus. I'd love to believe that that's true. But the truth is, I don't think that's what we're seeing here, even if perhaps there is that possibility that it did later happen. But we're seeing something different here. As we thought about last week, Pilate doesn't want to convict Jesus, but it's not because he believes Jesus' claims. Rather, it's that he doesn't even find them credible. He can't imagine how anyone could have ever taken Jesus seriously. In a sense, he's right, but for the wrong reasons. But the outcome's the same. He doesn't, at this point, think Jesus deserves to be punished. But the reason I think John points out here that he sought all the more to release him, again, is not about truth or innocence. It's about control. He wants to show that Jesus is wrong. He truly is in control. He will have his own way here. In a sense, it feels like he's looking for a loophole. Jesus and the Jews, they've made this a referendum on two fronts. It's a referendum on truth and on authority. And Pilate feels like he's losing on both fronts. He's already been forced to question what even is truth last week, and now Jesus has once again challenged him on this position of control, of power. Pilate wants to prove that truly he is in control here. And I think he wants to do that in two ways. He wants to do that first by not giving the crowd what they want. Because he can't show that the empire is weak. But he also wants to show Jesus that he has the authority here. He's not beholden either to Jesus or to the empire, or to the Jews, rather. That the empire is sovereign. The empire is in control. And so right now he wants to release Jesus because he's trying to find that loophole that doesn't give the Jews what they want without even needing to side with Jesus, to suggest that he truly is who he claims to be. Of course, in the midst of it all, he also needs to prevent the crowd from rioting. He won't truly take a stand for Jesus, but he doesn't want to concede anything to the Jewish people either. But the thing is, Jesus and the crowd, they aren't going to allow him to sit on the fence here. Ultimately, when it comes to Jesus, everyone has to take a stand. Everyone has to make a choice. There really isn't any middle ground here. Unless you embrace him for who he is, you reject him. There isn't that third way. There isn't that loophole available. We can't conclude that he's a good man, but he isn't all of the other things he claimed to be. It's as C.S. Lewis often posited, if he isn't truly who he said he is, if he isn't Lord, he's either a liar or a lunatic. He is not merely a good man. And you can't sit on the fence. You have to decide for yourself, who do you think he is? But the crowd, they pile on the pressure. If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So Pilate caves. He makes a decision out of fear of losing approval, losing his position. And the question remains, how often do we do the exact same thing? How often do we deny the full truth? Do we try to soften the blow of what Scripture really says about certain things? How often do we refuse to take a clear stand for truth? That's the challenge, but it's also the call. There are only two sides here. You're either on Jesus' side or you're against him. He calls us to stand firm in defending truth and integrity, even when it's unpopular. Which leads us then to the final few verses here. Those last few verses, verses 19 through 17, they leave us with a challenge. Who, ultimately, is your king? At this point, the people, they're faced with a choice. Which king do they want? Jesus, he is a king. Not only a king, he is the king above all kings. The promised king, the Messiah. And the people, they knew it. Just days earlier, right? These same people, they welcomed him into the city as king. They laid down their cloaks and their palm leaves in front of him, welcomed him as king. But when they were faced with the reality of the kind of king he was, they decided, maybe this isn't what we want after all. Pilate asked them an interesting question. Shall I crucify your king? I think at this point Pilate thinks he's found that loophole he was looking for. He's almost goading the people here. He knows that they can't admit that they've made Jesus the king. If they can, then he has permission to use the full might of the empire to put down this uprising. Deep down he knows that the Jews want to overthrow the Roman Empire. So he's goading them. Will you take the bait? Will you call him your king? So I can truly demonstrate the power we have? But of course, if they deny it, if they deny that he's a king, his hope is that gives him the permission to free Jesus. Because even at that point, if they deny that he's a king, then they deny that there's any charge that can be brought against him, right? They themselves seem to admit that there is no charge here. Either way, it seems Pilate thinks he gets to demonstrate his power and authority, but they turn it on him. We have no king but Caesar, is their response. It's a lie. They don't truly believe that. These are a people who desperately want to overthrow Caesar, want to be out from under his reign. The Jewish people historically have lived in captivity for so much of their history. And they're looking forward to when God will free them once again from this tyranny. And yet, when faced with a choice to embrace their true king, they flat out reject him. They deny him, they humiliate him. They openly choose an evil and wicked emperor that even Pilate knows that they want to be rid of, rather than following their Messiah. Because he challenges their assumptions. Because he gives them what they need, even though it isn't perhaps what they want. Because he focuses on eternal freedom, perhaps even more than here and now. So they reject him. They choose the lie. And to this very day, people continue to do the same thing. And yet here's the most amazing part. Though he is entirely innocent, though he could have stopped this at any point, he chooses to surrender. He chooses to die for the sins of those who hate him. Jesus, he accepted the injustice of the cross for me and for you, for all of those who will accept him. He chooses willingly, freely, to take the punishment that we deserve, to buy our freedom. Jesus' choice, it wasn't about personal vindication. It was about redemption for all humanity. Flash forward to 2019. The Innocence Project, they've taken another look at Hugh Burton's case. In the process, they uncovered a pattern of wrongful convictions by the police and DAs in that time and space. They've seen a pattern of unwillingness to really investigate the cases and seek the truth out of a desire simply to get a conviction, to clear the cases at all costs. They find an alternative suspect and all kinds of new evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Hugh Burton did not kill his mother. They took their evidence before the courts and finally exposed the truth. Hugh was innocent. He'd always been innocent. Though he was no longer in prison, even at this point, you can see how it feels to be declared innocent, to have that stigma of guilt removed. You can see just how much it means to him to finally have someone say those words, not guilty. Imagine Hugh's relief when the truth was revealed and his freedom was restored. Imagine if you'd been Hugh, just how incredible it would be to hear the judge speak those words, to say once and for all that you are not guilty. Now take that feeling and imagine the freedom that Jesus offers to us, not just in this life, but in eternity. The truth is, we all have a guilty verdict, and unlike Hugh Burton's, we are, in fact, guilty. Each of us sin, each of us fall short, each of us earn and deserve the punishment. We are all guilty of sin against an infinite and holy God. And yet, because of Jesus' punishment, because of his sacrifice, because he took the penalty that each one of us is due, the God of all eternity looks at us and declares that if we've received Jesus' sacrifice for ourselves, we too are not guilty. Though we did the thing, though we deserve the punishment, he looks at Jesus' righteousness. He looks at the eternal Son who speaks for us and says, not guilty. Here's the reality. The world, it's not perfect. It is broken, and sometimes human systems fail. Just look at Jesus. He is the only truly innocent person in all of history, and yet, at the hands of sinful and wicked men, he was punished. He was killed because of lies, because of false accusations, because a man was more interested in his own position than in finding the truth, and because selfish religious leaders sided with a Caesar that they hated, even over their promised king. Certainly human institutions can fail to provide either justice or truth at times. Yet Jesus' sacrifice shows us that God's justice is perfect. His love will never fail. And because of his love, the opportunity is there for each of us to trust in Christ the innocent King, who endured for us the ultimate injustice and makes us right with him. And then, as we receive that forgiveness, the challenge remains for each of us to share it with a world that needs to hear it. For each of us, that is ultimately the challenge, isn't it? Where do we need to proclaim his truth? To share and offer the forgiveness that only comes through Jesus. To tell others that they too can be found not guilty, though they have done the thing, that they can experience the freedom that only comes from Jesus. Each of us are called to share that with others so that they too can accept the forgiveness that Jesus offers and experience for themselves what we have found. So this Christmas season, as people think perhaps about Jesus coming to earth, as we have that opportunity to remind people of Jesus' birth, let's not lose sight of the reason why he came in the first place. That he ultimately was born to die. The death of a criminal for our sake. The death that we deserve. Though it's good for us to focus on at this Christmas season of the joy of new birth, of Jesus coming into the world. Let's not miss the opportunity to proclaim the fullness of the gospel, the whole truth of who he is and why he came.